All right, APHUG, it is video note time. All right, happens from time to time, and we're kind of there. Gonna run you through about half an hour. We'll see what that can do in terms of whether we can take care of one slide, two slides, three slides. I don't know. We'll see. But I'm not gonna. I'm gonna limit it to 30 minutes. All right, so your suffering will have a limit to it. All right. This is where we finished up. We were going through our big collection of, first all of our different types of boundaries, and then we're starting to focus in on classification of boundaries, kind of big picture when we are looking at the creation of boundaries. And we finished up on superimposed boundaries. That was the one that we were talking about just about the time we were shutting down on all this, and talking about Africa, which we talked about earlier with imperialism and all that. So just that idea of when outsiders come in and tell people of a country, a state, a region, what the boundaries are going to be. That is when they're superimposed, right? They're kind of more or less being forced on you. So I'd mentioned when we shut down that we weren't completely done, that there were a couple other boundaries that we still needed to add in there. And so one of them, or as we get down, I guess it's the last two that we have, militarized boundaries, or just the way they sound, okay, militarized. And so the use of military power to make sure that crossings are extremely limited, or maybe not possible at all. Probably the best example that we have of this is the boundary between North and South Korea. It is what a lot of people consider to be one of the most dangerous boundaries in the entire world. Because both sides, North and South Korea, when the Korean War was fought in the early 1950s, a ceasefire was called in 1953. There was never any official treaty that ended the Korean War, so technically it's still going. All right, even though we're now, it's almost 70 years out. There are still the two countries, North and South Korea, are still technically at war, and so they have very heavy military presence on the boundary between the two. The United States, because we are still a pretty tight ally of South Korea, some of the military forces there enforcing their boundary are U.S. Troops and U.S. military personnel, and it is definitely what we would consider to be a pretty dangerous location. So that would be your example of a militarized boundary. And then the last one is an open boundary. All right. This is one where we have all kinds of debates here in the United States. Do we have an open border down? And technically we don't. I know that it may sometimes seem that way with, the amount of illegal immigration that we have seen in our country at times. But legally, we don't. People who cross our border are breaking the law. That's why sometimes they are, arrested and sent right back. We don't have an open border. I think sometimes politicians kind of like to throw those back and forth to kind of, little zingers at the other side. Now, an example of where there are open borders would be the European Union. Okay. Back in the 1990s, when the European Union became a reality, basically the agreement that all these European countries voluntarily joined, and most of it was economic, was to create ease of trade between all the different European states, countries, nations. But one of the things that they agreed to along with that is that their borders would be basically open to each other. That you wouldn't necessarily, if you were a citizen of one of those European Union countries, you didn't have to always be flashing like a passport, that sort of thing, that you have that ease of travel between other European Union countries. And so they do exercise and make use of fairly open borders. Okay. And I think that pretty much covers our tour of borders, boundaries. I need to be more proper with that, to use that term boundary rather than border. Okay, because that's kind of more legalistic when we use the term boundary, which will take us into the world of boundary disputes. Okay, and believe it or not, yes, there's a whole nother list of examples of different types of boundary disputes. Like I tell you, when we peel the lid open here on the whole world of boundaries, holy cow, leave it to APHUG to figure out a lot of little specific details that are all included in it. So let's break them down. Your first example is a definitional boundary dispute, okay? And this is when you have two states, could be, two regions, two political entities that basically are just having a disagreement about where a boundary actually kind of belongs. A good example that I have there in the parentheses for you is Chile and Argentina, and it's pretty much. I mean, they do have lines drawn on the map, and they have both agreed to treaties that then documents that say this is where the boundary lies between our two countries. But it's very, very mountainous territory down there. It's very, very rugged. And sometimes trying to kind of do the fine interpretation of the geography there can get a little bit gray, a little bit mushy. And it's not like a disagreement where Chile and Argentina threaten war against each other or anything that serious. But there are times where they're kind of like quibbling a little bit here and there about just the exact definition of the limits of one territory, and then when the other's territory kind of begins to go from the other side of the boundary there. Okay, so definitional, yeah, that's usually it is. It's fine little problems and issues. Okay, nothing major. The more major are locational boundary disputes, and this is where you're just straight up are saying that where you've drawn a boundary has absolutely no basis on reality. We believe that it is 100 miles in the other direction, 75 miles in the other direction. Okay, this is major. And so the example I have there for you is going back in history and back to the 1930s. And that term irredentism that you see there at the end of that little list, Germany, Poland, we're gonna dive in that a little bit more. And irredentism is a concept when one country believes that a part of another state belongs to them because of usually some kind of a historic or cultural kind of a connection. Adolf Hitler would use irredentism in a few different situations before World War II broke out, basically saying that the people that lived in different states, some were in Czechoslovakia, Austria, eventually Poland. He said that the people living in parts of those countries were Germanic culturally. Okay, that they were more German than they were Czech or Austrian or Polish. And he pretty much made the demand that German people belong to Germany. And he wasn't suggesting those people should pack up and move to Germany. He's suggesting that Germany should get the land that they live on, and that should be added to Germany. Okay, so with Poland, there was a whole large portion of Poland called Danzig that was populated by a lot of Germanic people, and Hitler pretty much told Poland that's ours. That you should give that to us. And he used that partially as kind of his excuse to invade Poland in 1939, and that was the invasion that triggered the start of World War II in Europe. Okay, so locational boundary disputes can really blow up into really big conflicts, and they don't get much bigger than World War II, which the biggest conflict in human history. Part of it started as a locational boundary dispute, at least part of it, right? Operational boundary disputes. So how a border actually functions, and with that one. There we can kind of look at, we could get into kind of some of the nuts and bolts over, the United States and Mexico. We have had arguments with Mexico before about what it is you need to do to be able to cross the boundary between the United States and Mexico. What kind of identification we have. How do we function when there's someone who wants asylum in the United States? Maybe they feel like their life is threatened. Think about that video we watched about those boys coming up from from Central America and trying to get to the United States. They're trying to escape gang warfare and the fact that they felt like they wouldn't survive if they stayed down there. But when they get to the boundary between the United States and Mexico, there they run into troubles because there's not a firm agreement how that all operates. As far as asking for permission to seek political asylum in the United States. What are the processes? And when we deal with a lot of that illegal immigration, people who sneak across the border regardless, that makes it even more complicated, right? And so when you have those kind of issues, we've seen a little bit of that took place also between places like Israel and Gaza. Some of the issues that came up with how were Palestinians and Israelis able to cross back and forth because that was again another hotly contested boundary and two peoples that they've been at war with each other since October 2023. So those kinds of issues going on. Okay, operational. The other one I have here is allocational. And with an allocational boundary dispute, you get your definition there. Probably the best example I have for you is that map over to the left side. And that is showing the country of Iraq and the country that borders it to its south, Kuwait. Iraq claimed that Kuwait was basically stealing Iraqi oil that was underground. That some of the Kuwaiti oil fields that were up in the northern part of Kuwait or western part of Kuwait were actually pumping oil underneath, the surface of the ground, where a lot of oil is, but they were pumping it underneath the boundary between Kuwait and Iraq. Okay, or excuse me, yeah, Iraq, and it ended up turning into a war. Iraq eventually they invaded Kuwait, claiming that Kuwait had been stealing their oil. The reality was there was very little evidence that was actually happening, and that turned into the Persian Gulf War back in the early 1990s. The United States, a whole bunch of other countries got involved. The United Nations got involved, and in the end, Iraq was defeated in this war against Kuwait. But it all started out as an allocational boundary dispute, okay, over the very, very valuable resource of oil and, who the oil belonged to, that kind of a thing. All right, so those are some examples for you of boundary disputes. Now we jump over and we take a look at the influence of boundaries, okay? And so we'll start you off nice and simple, and that is where nationalism comes into play when it comes to boundaries. Kind of getting back to that concept of territoriality, all right? And the willingness to be able to to defend your state, defend your country. And when we see boundaries, that's usually what is a trigger point of a war, is when one country crosses the boundary of another, and then it's like, gloves off, here we go. And so, think about it. Even here in the United States, most of you would be able to identify the shape of the United States. You know what our boundaries are, whether they're boundaries of land, at sea. And we have that identity, with our country. And it's based somewhat on our boundaries. It is part of our national identity. And so that all comes into play when, someone threatens to cross our boundaries in a, warlike manner. And, we're fortunately for the United States, the last time we really had to kind of deal with that was, you could argue, 9/11 when we were attacked. But the last time we actually faced the threat of potential invasion was going all the way back to World War II. And you definitely, Americans rose to the challenge to make sure that neither Nazi Germany or Japan was going to be able to actually launch any kind of invasion against our country. Okay, that kind of a thing. You see other examples of that in World War II as well, when the British were under attack by the Germans, and likewise facing the threat of a land invasion. and watching the British population mobilize to defend themselves. They did such an effective job of preparing for it, it scared the Germans off. They never actually even tried to fully invade the British during World War II. They just tried to bomb them into surrendering, which never ended up working. All right. Let's see. Role of cooperation. I just mentioned talking about the European Union here a few moments ago, and we can see where the boundaries, and in this case, kind of the easing of boundaries. Again, opening those boundaries can really lead to an era of cooperation amongst different states, different countries. You with Europe, and you look at the history of Europe and how much fighting has happened in that one little continent, that one region of the world. The stretch of peace, which you could argue has started to fracture a bit with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but Ukraine isn't part of the European Union. They would like to be, but they're not. But that is the longest stretch, okay, going from kind of like the end of World War II to right now. That is the longest stretch of actual peace in Europe in more than 7 centuries. Okay, and you can at least attribute part of that peace, that stretch of just non-conflict. You can contribute part of that to this, again, this easing of boundaries, these opening of boundaries between all the EU countries. And so, boom, there's a very, very positive influence when you take a different stance with boundaries, that we don't do like the Koreans, and we're not going to have our boundaries all militarized. We're going to do the opposite. They're open, and go back forth, all that kind of thing. Right. Speaking of the Koreans, we're right back in there. And so when we talk about the role of division and or isolation, when we look at what's going on, you look at South Korea. And while recently, very recently, they've had a few little political issues, by and large, South Korea has been a very successful country. Very, very successful automobile building industry, economically very powerful, very successful. They're a democratic country. They elect their own leaders, that sort of thing, and are seen as kind of just a contributing member of the Asiatic world, and a major trade partner of even the United States. Right? You go across the border into North Korea, and it's a completely different picture. A very, very closed off, very, very closed down society. A country that number one isolates itself from most of its neighbors and most of the world, and is isolated by a lot of other countries because of their continual testing and trying to basically testing to try to acquire their own nuclear weapons. Many countries, including ours, will have nothing to do with them, and so they've kind of been just kind of put out, and figuratively speaking, kind of out onto an island of their own, and they really do little to nothing to try to change that. They have a few countries, Russia, a little bit of a relationship with China, but very few friends there in the world. Very kind of, when you look at the difference between North Korea and South Korea, man, it's yin and yang. You don't see differences as stark, in many other places around the world as you see there. So sometimes the role of just that boundary, dividing the two Koreas, even though they're still, multi-state, you're still that cultural significance that Koreans are still Koreans, whether you're talking about North or South. They have shared history, but that is a very, very, kind of a dark division that juxtaposes the two sides, the North and the South. All right. And then boundaries. Oh my goodness. Let's hope we don't have to deal with another one round of these in our lifetime. And that is, when more recently we see the role of something like the COVID pandemic. That was global, was worldwide, and how the spread of that pandemic, the fear that created, saw the closing of borders on boundaries all over the world. Countries that were trying to limit the spread of COVID into their countries and limit the amount of death and destruction that COVID was doing, and we really don't. That was an example that we don't have a lot to compare to. The last major pandemic we had before that was the Spanish flu at the end of World War One, and that was really before the era of globalization. And so back then, it was just kind of every country kind of doing its own little thing to fight it, push back on it. But this, in a very globalized world, brought a whole new dimension to a pandemic because we are so tightly, knitted together as different states and different regions through, communications and transportation and trade. And part of the reason that we suffered so much economically and the rest of the world as well is because by closing all those boundaries, we were also closing off trade. And that is where, the price of everything started going up. People ready to murder each other over a roll of toilet paper, all that business. Okay. And so sometimes the influence of boundaries can even play into health issues like that, like the pandemic. All right. From there, we're going to jump over to how boundaries work when we start focusing on oceans, seas, bodies of water. Okay. And at the core of this is, when you look at the Atlantic, the Pacific Ocean, the Indian Ocean, the Gulf of Mexico, who does the water belong to? Yeah, exactly. I don't know if that's something you've ever given any thought to. If you're out on the coast, at Cannon Beach or Lincoln City or something like that, and you're looking out to the horizon, how much of that water that you're looking out to is actually United States water, or is it? I don't know if that's something you've ever given any thought to, but believe it or not, states do have possession of certain amounts of water. All right. Needless to say, if you've got rivers and lakes and all that sort of thing, that's internal, that's kind of automatic. All right. That's the possession of the state it belongs to. That could be, if we're narrowed it down even to individual states, like here in the U.S., then individual states will kind of help with the management of waterways. Whether it's the Columbia River, whether it's lakes and that sort of thing. Sometimes the federal government or national government will step in and play a role with that too, especially if it's like the Columbia River, which is a river that is used heavily for trade, for cargo ships. Coming in and out of port and heading out up in Puget Sound. It's kind of the same thing, okay? But we're going to look at it in kind of the big picture, all right? And so we'll start you off with what are called territorial seas, all right? And you've got your definition there. What that stands for when I say that a state controls 12 nautical miles off the coast, all right? So when you're looking out, when you're standing there on the beach, Cannon Beach, Lincoln City, whatever it may be, and you're looking out towards the water, 12 miles from that coastline out there, all of that water is under the control of the United States of America. Okay? We have control over those 12 nautical miles. Those of you that are curious, what's the difference between a mile and a nautical mile? It's not a whole lot. One nautical mile equals 1.15 miles. Okay, the nautical miles, they kind of use degrees to measure distance, that sort of a thing. All right, so 12 nautical miles means that's our water. If a foreign ship comes sailing into that, they need to indicate to us why they're coming into our water. Most of the time, they're going to be signaling us to let us know, and we let them come because they are a cargo ship, and it's like, hey, we got a whole lot of stuff for you to sell in your stores, and we're heading to port to unload this stuff. It might be a shipload of cars that were built over in Asia that are coming over here. It could be a shipload of goods that were produced in some of those Apple factories over in Asia. But they will signal, they message their communications, and they have permission then to come into our national waters and then, into a port or a harbor where they're going to unload their cargo and then head back again, right? It's 12 nautical miles. From there, we have what is called the contiguous zone. Okay, contiguous zone. That doesn't sound right. Contiguous zone, and so that is 24 nautical miles off our coast. And so, in effect, you can kind of think of our territorial seas are 12 nautical miles, and then another 12 nautical miles added on top of that, okay, is our contiguous zone. And that gets a little more, it's a little more gray area when I put in there limited state control, all right? And so when we talk about that contiguous zone, yeah, it's kind of like you've got, we can still enforce, we can still, like our Navy, our Coast Guard, that sort of thing. We can still enforce some of our laws in the contiguous zone. If we think maybe there's a shipload of illegal immigrants that are trying to come to our shores to unload, people and to sneak into our country, if they're in our contiguous zone, we can use our enforcement agencies like the U.S. Navy or the Coast Guard to stop that ship and to ask to communicate with them, possibly to board that ship, and to be able to search and make sure that things are legal and it's all good. If they're in our contiguous zone, so at least 24 nautical miles within that zone, we can stop them. Okay. Now we just can't stop for any willy-nilly reason. We see a ship flying another flag, and it's out there in the contiguous zone, and we just want to stop it because we want to stop it. We have to have good grounds to do it. Okay. Suspicion, and that suspicion has to be more than just, I got a gut feeling. Either you've intercepted some kind of messages, maybe from ship to shore that sounds suspicious, like someone on that ship is trying to plan with someone on shore, a place to sneak people on shore, those kinds of things. Okay. Anyhow, that's your contiguous zone. The exclusive economic zone, all right, the EEZ. Now you can see that one. That is heading out upwards of 200 nautical miles from the coastline there. Okay, and basically this is getting. Oh, hold on here. I got to take care of a dog real quick. Sorry, had a dog who I could tell needed to get outside really fast. Anyhow, yeah, the EEZ. So where we have this one is, and when we talk about what kind of rights do we have in the EEZ. This kind of gets into resources, okay? It could be drilling for oil, things like that. And this gives a state the ability to kind of restrict, to say, well, if we're going to be drilling for oil out, in the ocean bed, that EEZ means that only we can do it. Okay, I suppose I don't know if there's situations like this around the world, to be honest, where some states or countries sell those EEZ rights to another country to come in and maybe do a little exploration for oil, that sort of thing. But exclusive means it can't be shared; it belongs to someone else, or it just belongs only to the state itself. And so that's where we have that restriction in there. Okay, but that goes a full 200 nautical miles. Out there from that point, all right? And then, and I am watching the clock, I know we're getting down there, so we're going to see if we can wrap up the basics on this, okay? High seas is everything out past that 200 miles, okay? And when we get into the high seas, that we're talking about, that is water where, technically speaking, anyone should be able to travel with no restrictions, no fear of, anyone's Navy or Coast Guard trying to stop them. That is water that we agree belongs to everyone, right? No one has possession over it. And so that is the terminology we give it, is high seas, that is out there for everyone, right? Number 5, yes, we were talking about the conflict in the South China Sea. Just yesterday, well, just a couple days ago here, and that would be an example of where conflict can come into play, where different countries are kind of claiming maybe more access to water than they legally really should be claiming, and getting into some of those kind of issues. The conflict I have example there for you goes back all the way to the 1980s. Libya, North African country, just kind of arbitrarily decided that actually they weren't going to allow anyone to make use of waters, and they were going way out beyond the 200 miles. They were pretty much saying just it's all ours, more or less. And the United States pretty much said, no, that's not. That is international agreement that the high seas are the high seas, and we ended up in a little mini shooting war not really a declared war, but with Libya, and ended up shooting down some of their jets, engaged our jets over the high seas, and we kind of, in a way had to put Libya back in its place and say, you need to respect these laws just like everyone else does, right? And then where I'm going to wrap you up here is with number 6, and another one of our fancy little terms here, choke point. And a choke point is a waterway. Usually it's going to be examples of choke points are going to be straits, canals, where waterways get really, really narrow. Okay, where you have land, and these are usually areas that are really, like it says, are critical to trade. You can think of like the Strait of Hormuz in the Middle East. Kind of there in the Persian Gulf, the Suez Canal, the Panama Canal. Those are choke points, okay, and sometimes those are places likewise that have ended up being kind of the center of conflict. Matter of fact, we got talk right now about the United States wanting to reclaim control over the Panama Canal. Could be some of that kind of thing that. Yeah, ends up being a conflict or an issue coming here. But yeah, 90%, they consider about 90% of the goods that end up being transported by sea around the world end up having to go through a choke point to get from one place to another. So these are important and can sometimes lead to problems, right? And I'm going to have a problem if I keep talking. I'm just crossing at 31 minutes, and I promised you 30. I went over by a minute. Get a lawyer, sue me, good luck, okay? But we'll call it quits right there. It's a good breaking point anyway, and we'll be back to it together when we're in class, all right? Thanks, and I am out.